We are all conditioned to recognize warfare. We see it in the trenches of the First World War, in the massive fleets of the Spanish Armada, and in the satellite images of modern conflict zones. We measure war by its visceral cost: casualties, destroyed infrastructure, and territorial loss. But what if the most decisive, most relentless, and most profitable wars of the 21st century are being fought in complete silence? What if the primary instruments of great power competition are no longer tanks and missiles, but trillions of dollars on a digital ledger? This is the hidden reality of the modern global economy. This is the truth of the currency wars. A conflict that transcends traditional trade policy, where financial balance sheets have been weaponized, leading to profound international instability and acting as a significant precursor to broader geopolitical friction. This documentary will provide a rigorous analysis of how money itself became the ultimate weapon. We will uncover the historical blueprints of competitive devaluation, dissect the modern arsenal used by central banks, and reveal how policies presented as domestic necessities, like quantitative easing, are in fact devastating financial attacks on competing economies. Understanding this dynamic is essential because, in a currency war, you do not have to be a soldier to become a casualty. The conflict over sovereign exchange rates represents a critical domain of modern geopolitical competition. The traditional view of a currency war involved governments directly selling their own currency on the open market to weaken it, making their exports cheaper. This is competitive devaluation. Today, the war is far more sophisticated. Central bank economists often dismiss the term currency wars, preferring to frame interventions as benign domestic economic management. However, strategic risk analysts recognize these conflicts as central to global instability and state rivalry. The central argument of the bullets versus balance sheets thesis is that unconventional monetary policies, particularly quantitative easing, QE, and sophisticated financial market interventions, have been weaponized by major powers. They transform the seemingly dull balance sheet of a central bank into a primary, non-kinetic instrument of competition. Money is not neutral. It is a tool of strategy, control, and sometimes destruction. The conflict over money decides who gets rich, who starves, who rules, and who obeys. Currency conflicts are fundamentally rooted in domestic economic distress. Governments turn to monetary expansion when they face politically paralyzing problems at home: high unemployment and stagnant wages, low growth and weak financial sectors, massive politically untouchable debts and entitlements. When standard short-term remedies involve reducing interest rates to stimulate slow growth, the resulting monetary divergence inherently serves as a competitive mechanism against other nations. This shift exports domestic problems onto the global stage. The difficulty in recognizing a currency war lies in the lack of clear international enforcement. The IMF has criteria, such as protracted large-scale FX intervention. Yet, historically, the IMF has never formally determined that a member country has manipulated its currency. This institutional ambiguity allows nations to wield monetary weapons while maintaining plausible deniability. In contrast, the U.S. Treasury uses criteria like preventing balance of payments adjustments or gaining unfair competitive advantage. But even the U.S. government's designations often only designate a few nations, like Switzerland, Taiwan, or Vietnam. The true scale of the warfare is masked by technical jargon and diplomatic silence. The modern currency war has deep historical roots, demonstrating that major monetary resets are often preceded by periods of ruthless financial competition. The Great Depression era provides the first definitive blueprint for total financial breakdown. The gold standard collapse. The pressures of the Depression led to the collapse of the classical gold standard. As nations abandoned the fixed peg to gold, they gained the freedom to devalue their currencies. The strategy. Nations simultaneously engaged in competitive devaluation and implemented aggressive tariffs, like the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act in the U.S. This strategy is known as Beggar-Thy-Neighbor, where a country tries to solve its domestic problems, unemployment, by actively hurting its trading partners, by making its exports cheaper and theirs more expensive. The outcome? The result was a catastrophic collapse of global trade, reducing it by over 21%. This period of sustained financial conflict and the disintegration of monetary coordination acted as a significant catalyst for the economic conditions that led toward World War II. The lesson is clear. When monetary cooperation fails, the world fragments. The second major blueprint for financial conflict was the abrupt end of the post-Ubuntu Bretton Woods system. Bretton Woods Promise. Established in 1944, the Bretton Woods system pegged global currencies to the US dollar, and the dollar itself was tied to gold at $35 an ounce. The system was supposed to provide stability, but it was structurally flawed, ultimately acting as a financial empire engineered by the US. The betrayal. By the late 1960s, the US was running massive deficits to finance the Vietnam War and social programs. Foreign nations began questioning the dollar's value, demanding US gold. Facing a looming crisis, President Richard Nixon unilaterally suspended the convertibility of the dollar to gold in August 1971. This was the Nixon shock. The attack. This unilateral act was, in effect, a massive, immediate devaluation of the dollar relative to its metallic promise. It immediately shifted the global system to floating exchange rates. The US dollar depreciated by a third in the 1970s, effectively making US goods cheaper abroad and taxing foreign holders of dollars. This was a financial attack on America's creditors, proving that when the US Treasury is threatened, the dollar's value is the first thing to be sacrificed. The post-2009 Great Recession introduced the newest and most sophisticated weapon into the currency wars, unconventional monetary policy, primarily quantitative easing, QE. QE involves the central bank, like the Federal Reserve or ECB, purchasing assets, typically long-term government bonds, to inject massive liquidity into the financial system. The policy's stated goal is to lower long-term interest rates and stimulate domestic economic activity. However, the international spillover is undeniable. QE acts as an implicit devaluation. The liquidity push. By flooding the domestic market with new money, QE makes the home currency less attractive for savings and investment, encouraging capital outflow. The interest rate channel. QE lowers yields on domestic long-term bonds. This reduction in relative return motivates global investors, the hot money, to flee the advanced economy and seek higher yields elsewhere. The unwanted outcome. This capital flight causes the initiating currency to weaken, effectively providing a competitive advantage to the QE issuer. Although advanced economies defend QE as a purely domestic necessity, the effect is clear. It weakens the currency and pushes exports out. The financial warfare fought through QE is not cost-free for the initiating nation. Every weapon carries a domestic trade-off. Asset bubbles and inflation. QE risks creating asset bubbles, everything from stocks to real estate, and accelerates domestic inflation. It creates the illusion of prosperity. Wealth. Skewing. Because QE operates through financial markets, it favors those who own assets, the rich, over those who primarily hold cash or fixed income, the poor and middle class. QE accelerates wealth distribution skewing, embodying the modern Cantillon effect. While Western powers use QE as an implicit weapon, countries aiming for sustained export dominance often rely on explicit depreciation through large-scale, sterilized intervention. China, historically, mastered this technique to secure its status as the world's manufacturing hub. By the 1990s and 2000s, Beijing understood that if the yuan stayed weak against the dollar, Chinese exports would look cheaper on the global market. This strategic currency manipulation was essential for capturing global industries, from steel and solar panels to electronics. China intentionally sacrificed short-term domestic purchasing power to achieve long-term global dominance. China's sustained trade surpluses meant that its exporters received vast amounts of US dollars. If the People's Bank of China, PBOC, simply exchanged those dollars for yuan, the domestic money supply would explode, causing hyperinflation. To maintain an artificially low exchange rate and prevent domestic inflation, the PBOC engaged in sterilized intervention. 1. Intervention. The central bank purchased the incoming foreign assets, US dollars, in exchange for newly issued domestic currency, yuan, with its exporters. This drove down the yuan's value. 2. Sterilization. To absorb the excess yuan and prevent domestic inflation, the PBOC issued high-interest bonds or raised reserve requirement ratios, RRR, for commercial banks. This effectively locked up the newly printed yuan, sterilizing the inflationary impact. The cost of this financial warfare is visible in the PBOC's balance sheet. Foreign assets grew to account for a massive 84% of its total assets by 2013, up from 40% in 2000. This leverage represents a massive fiscal liability, but it was deemed an acceptable cost for securing global trade dominance. China proved that money is a weapon, and currency wars decide who wins the game of trade. The modern financial conflict leverages interconnected global capital markets to transmit instability, ensuring that the monetary policies of major industrialized economies become a direct source of competitive pressure on others. The expansionary QE shocks initiated by advanced economies, AEs, act as a global liquidity push that significantly impacts emerging market economies, EMEs. The search for higher yield drives massive capital inflows, frequently characterized as hot money, rushing into EMEs. These flows cause significant financial effects in the receiving countries. An exchange rate appreciation, making their exports instantly more expensive. A reduction in domestic long-term bond yields, a rapid stock market boom. This situation is often strongest for vulnerable economies. The financial benefits are superficial. The forced currency appreciation hurts the EME's export competitiveness, effectively transferring external demand back to the AE that initiated the QE. QE, therefore, acts precisely as a beggar-thy-neighbor outcome, obligating EMEs to choose between two painful options. 1. Accept appreciation. Allow the currency to rise, losing export share and jobs. 2. Intervene and risk inflation. Engage in costly, unsterilized intervention, buying foreign currency, and risk domestic inflation. This dilemma transforms the competitive landscape by forcing policy responses from weaker economies, reacting to the involuntary spillovers from stronger economies' domestic stimulus. It is an effective, non-kinetic form of financial control. The instability exported through currency wars is compounded by the pre-existing debt trap. Nations that are heavily indebted, like Mexico in 1982, are instantly vulnerable when global interest rates spike or investor confidence cracks. Mexico's default in 1982 and the peso collapse in 1994 were warnings. The $50 billion bailout rushed in by the U.S., and IMF was not primarily to save Mexico as S people, but to save the American banks and investors who stood to lose everything. This confirms the ultimate reality. Debt and dependence turn nations into hostages. The financial conflict is often about protecting the creditors, not the citizens. The evidence strongly suggests that sustained financial conflict and the disintegration of monetary coordination act as significant precursors or catalysts for broader geopolitical and, potentially, military escalations. When the balance sheets fail, the bullets follow. In modern geopolitics, sanctions turn banking rails into battlefields. Western powers have repeatedly used the dollar's hegemony, the petrodollar status, to freeze foreign reserves, as seen with Russia. This is the modern equivalent of seizing gold trains during the Russian Revolution. This weaponization proves the U.S. controls the system, but also demonstrates how risky it is for any nation to depend on it. The realization that a country's reserves can vanish with one policy decision is driving a slow, quiet exodus toward alternatives like gold and non-dollar trade. Every empire believes its currency is eternal. Rome thought its denarius would last forever. Britain believed the pound was untouchable. America holds the same faith today regarding the dollar. Yet, history shows that once trust cracks, the collapse is swift. The Roman currency crisis wasn't just about bad emperors, it was about the fragility of money itself when abused by power. The lesson is that financial power, when wielded aggressively without global coordination, inevitably leads to fragmentation, just as the competitive devaluations of the 1930s led to trade collapse. The system counts on ignorance. The financial tricks that kept Roman citizens broke are the same ones draining your digital wallet today. If you understand the traps, you can act outside their reach. Real wealth. Focus on building real wealth that cannot be inflated away. Assets that hold value, skills that command demand, and networks of trust. Knowledge is leverage. Financial education is not a hobby. It is survival and resistance. You must read central bank announcements and hear the consequences, not just the words. You must understand that the system is designed to protect itself, not you. The final choice. You are a participant in this war. The only choice you have is whether you face the cycle blind or awake. The currency wars reveal the ultimate power structure. Wars are never just fought with swords or guns. They are fought with money, and money always has its masters. The architects of financial policy hold the reins. The question is whether you will recognize the warning in time. The conflict defined by bullets versus balance sheets confirms that the core dynamics of power endure. Central banks, armed with trillions of printed credit, now command economic consequences more profound than any conventional army. The tragedy of the modern system is that the constant financial friction, born of domestic desperation, threatens the cohesion of the global trade framework. History is telling us what comes next. The failure to coordinate and the relentless use of monetary weapons will lead to the collapse of trust and ultimately to a more fragmented and dangerous world. The only defense is awareness. History does not repeat, but if you do not understand the financial history of war, it will crush you all the same.